right. Well, welcome to our last reader hangout of the semester for English 3950 children's literature. I'm guessing we'll not be able to talk about Graveyard Book much tonight because I'm guessing everyone hasn't finished reading it. We don't want to do any spoilers. But we may do some previews of it if some folks have some questions toward the end. Because last week we drafted on the reading ladders, we only read Feathers, which we talked about in the last hangout, and then the new book that we talked about was So Hard to Say by Alex Sanchez. So we'll talk about that probably at lunch tonight. If you've already looked at the questions for Graveyard Book, though, you notice that they're very much about connecting Graveyard Book to earlier books. So I really purposely chose that as the last one because I think while it's fantasy and mystery, it even has a little bit of very tiny bit of romance genre in it, not much. It brings together the semester really well, and the characters in that and their storylines and the issues they engage with, I think, connect well with other books we've done. So really as a final project, that one's about trying to get you in your discussion questions to think both about that book and something we've read before and sort of make some of those connections. It's not really a chance to sort of catch you so you haven't read something because you can choose whatever you want to connect it to. But I like it as a summing up book, in part because it really does bring that Peter Pan story forward. But why don't we get started first by talking about So Hard to Say. So just general question, did you like the book? Did you not like the book? What did you like or not like about it?
I'll go first, if that's okay. I think my favorite part of this book were the characters, and the previous books, the characters weren't my favorite. Some of them were my least favorite. Like for some reason in Feathers, I just didn't connect with the characters, and I'm not sure why. But I really connected with these characters, and I felt like I almost more, because my major is family community services, so I felt almost like I wanted to like help Fred. I like re-nicknamed him Fred. I was like, that's what I felt like I needed to help him, and like I wanted to like advocate for him and jump in there, and that was cool that the book like did that for me.
I think we see a lot of books that do that, and I don't know if you read about Alex Sanchez or looked anything up about him, but he is a counselor, and so a lot of his novels grow out of his experience working with young people and trying to help them over problems or to deal with their anxieties or issues that they have. So particularly his first novel is a series of novels called Rainbow Boys. It was about it's a high school set novel. You can definitely hear how he is a counselor and therapist because things happen and you're like, is he giving me a therapy session or is this just a novel? So yeah, I'm not surprised you noticed that. Anybody else?
I really liked how it just took the whole view of something that I didn't understand myself personally and like gave me insight on that, because I know it's already hard enough to like fit in at school, but then when you see it through the point of view of someone who's like hiding something about themselves, I thought that was really interesting. And I liked how Zio, like the author, really like captured like a 13-year-old girl. Like, because then it just made me remember how I was when I was younger, so I just thought that was really neat.
Say a little bit more about that, Zio as 13-year-old girl, because for me, she is a struggle. That voice of hers sounds too much like a 13-year-old girl, and I was like, oh my god, 13-year-old girl.
Well, that's kind of what I liked about it, because, I mean, when you read stories and you have, like, a 30-year-old girl or, like, a man or this, that, and the other, you create the voice in your own head. So when the, like, dialogue through the story, like, you really captured, like, a young, premature 13-year-old girl. Like, the really irritating voice and, like, the irritating things that would be said and all that. So I thought that was really cool.
She feels realistic to me. I've worked with middle schoolers many years, and I can see the sexies. I see them as a clique of girlfriends who are gossiping and hanging out and they're having fun, but they're also asking questions about their lives. So to me, they do seem really real.
Yeah, I would have to agree.
Others?
I like how the book was relatable amongst all the characters. I mean, you have Frederick, he's like a shy, timid kid, doesn't really, talk to others. He's in a new environment, moving from a different home, and then you have really outgoing and flirty. So I think there was like a character that anyone could relate to while still going over the struggles of homosexuality and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's interesting because like it feels like the story is about Frederick, and yet half the story is about CO2, right? And then you have all these other characters, and they're all going through something, and yet because of the subject, right? What feels really powerful is Frederick's story. But I think one of the things that really always gets me about this is how much of this story is about Frederick, but it's really how much is about CO and her relationship with her mother and her relationship with her father, who is probably gay, but that's kind of left open a bit, like it's not foreclosed on. And so even though I felt like her mother knows the answer, she's holding that back and letting that be something that CO's father and CO talk about and process in their own time. And so yeah, for me, as much as the book is about Frederick, it's also about CO and like what she's going through and what she's experiencing. And someone on the discussion board made the comment that most or all of the girls in the don't have fathers at home, or they have stepfathers, which I don't think I had really paid attention to the first time I read it, but I thought was a really interesting dynamic for the story, right? So this very modern question of we really just don't live in a culture where all people's parents stay married, or were ever married for that matter. So what does that mean, and what does that look like? So it's another interesting sort of dynamic of the story.
I have a point about Zio, right? Is that how you say her name?
CO?
Yeah, I always thought about like while I was reading it, what it would have been like to like read the book. I read a book, I think it was like Battle of the Books, so it was like 5th grade, where they had the boy side of the book and then the girl side of the book. It was called Flipped. So I always thought of what it would have been like if they had a section of the book like after where it was her point of view, to see, because how confusing it might have been for her, thinking this new kid liked her, and then he doesn't know that he's even gay, so she obviously has no idea. So what it would have been like to hear it from her point of view, I thought that might have been cool.
No, that makes lots of sense. I think I've read the book you're talking about, but it's been forever, so it's been a long time. Hey, yeah. Conan, welcome.
Hey.
Hope you didn't have too much trouble getting in. We've already jumped in. We're talking about what we liked or didn't like about So Hard to Say. So feel free to jump in whenever.
All right. Well, I mean, when I read So Hard to Say, it just kind of, well, let me reverse that, actually. I really like the way he went back and forth from CO to Frederick, because I think you really got to see both sides of the story. And if you had seen it from just Frederick's point of view, you really wouldn't have gotten to see how it impacted the other characters in the story.
Yeah, so that using limited, I guess we call it limited omniscient or narration, right? So you only see in each chapter whose head you're in. And so I do think one of the things that's really interesting about that is that Frederick has no idea how his actions are impacting CO, because of course she's not going to say, right? She's talking to her sexy friends about that. But as readers, we get to see like how she misunderstands or how she reads too much into what's going on. I'm thinking about that scene where he really wants to not be holding her hand in the movie theater because his hand's asleep. And she's so excited because he's holding her hand, right? This is that first crush. I don't know, now that we're all so old, we probably don't remember those first crushes, but it feels like for CO, it's very much first crush moment. Any other comments about liking before we move on to any other questions? Or disliking? Was there something you didn't like about the novel? For me, it's after a while, Sia's voice gets on my nerves, but that's just because I'm an old man and 13-year-old girls, I don't hang out with them a lot. And that's probably as the world's supposed to be.
I definitely like the book, but I just think at some points, like you said, with Zio's voice, I kind of felt like it was more, they were a lot older. I kind of felt like at some points I was watching Sex in the City or something, and especially when they were all like trying to figure out, like with Frederick, when he was like pretty much questioning, and then with Zio like holding his hand, she was like reading all of this into it, and he was just like stuck. He was like, like I really don't know what to do or how to come out and say it. I just don't know. I just felt like sometimes they weren't 13, but then at other points they were 13. Like when she broke down about her father and then finding out that Frederick was like gay, I just kind of, I don't know. It just made me feel a little bit uncomfortable because it was like they were 13, but then at some points it didn't seem like they were really 13.
It's one of the difficulties. We talked a little bit at the beginning in one of the earlier lectures. I noted that children's lit is one of those special cases where adults write for children, and so the adult writers are always making guesses at what to do. And sometimes you'll get a novel. The novel Fangirl comes to mind. Have any of you ever heard of Fangirl or read Fangirl when you were in high school? It was one of those first novels that was all about IM culture and teen internet culture, and it was all BRB and all the initials and all the acronyms that kids were using on AOL IM back in the day. But it was, the author was trying so hard to write a novel in teen speak that it didn't seem realistic. Like, teens don't go around all day long just talking in IM code, right? Like you missed it. It was close. You tried it, but it kind of fell apart. One of the things Brittany kind of brought up that might be a good segue question or comment is you were talking about these moments where what they were doing or saying partly seemed too old, like maybe that wasn't quite 13, and then some seemed perfectly 13 years old. One of the things I think this novel really does an interesting job of bringing up is the way that all of us at some point have to learn really hard things, like how do you date someone, right? What does that mean? How do you talk to a boy or a girl? How do you know if someone likes you? And I think to me that's one of the really precious things about this is that they get so much of it so wrong, right? But I think that's probably how we were in middle school. Like, I certainly would never have talked to my mom or dad about how to do these things. That just would have been, so you would rely on your friends. So I guess I was just curious, like, when y'all were reading it, were there moments where you were like, yeah, I remember how hard that kind of thing was to do, or I don't know. I just like moments. I think the special question asked was like, how do you learn things like dating? How do you learn things like how to talk to someone else? Right? Where do you go from punching girls and pulling their hair to asking them out, kind of thing? And this novel seems right there in the middle in a really interesting way. So I just didn't know if any of y'all had any comments or thoughts about that.
Well, my internship's in a middle school, and I've worked in a couple middle schools now. And I love the age group because they're still children, but they want to be adults. So that's why I kind of liked how the book, they were 13, but you didn't really think they were 13 at sometimes because they're like, why are we talking about certain things? But then I remember being in middle school, and I guess now that you said that, you don't really remember, like, okay, so this is how you go talk to a boy, or this is how you go and do this. You just kind of do it because you grow up and it just starts to happen. But the book really, like, goes into it and you realize, like, middle school was just a messed up age where you do everything wrong. Like, everything comes out wrong. You don't mean what you say, and it's just, like, you're learning as you go. And in my experience teaching them and just watching, because a lot of, like, my internship is watching them, I'm just like in awe, like, aren't you only like 12? Like, you shouldn't be saying that or doing that, and that boy shouldn't be looking at you that way. And it's just interesting to see it in text when I've watched it in the classroom.
That's so true. So true. Spending 2 or 3 days in an elementary or middle school will change everything. All the things you thought you remembered about what childhood was and what people did, I think we forget a lot of stuff that goes on, and a lot of sort of random things. Lizzie's participating online, just asking questions, and she made the comment, the media is, I think maybe she means the media is one of the places where we learn these things, which is true, right? There are lots of TV shows and things like that, but other places, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I don't know about anyone else, but I definitely remember when I was a teenager, I was heavily influenced by like older friends. Like when I was 12 and 13, I had friends that were 15 or 16 years old, and kind of learned from their experience though too. So
That's interesting too. Having older friends, right? Did any of you? I guess these were not in fashion when y'all were young, but the Sweet Valley High books when I was a young person were huge. They were, there were these serial fictions, and they were all about high school kids. But fourth graders, when I was in fourth grade, we read those. It's all about reading up, right? Trying to learn about that next stage. And you were saying, Cooper, about having older friends and like that being a place where you learn things maybe that you should or shouldn't, right? But we don't see a lot of that in the novels we read this summer, where it tends to be if they're 13 or 12 or whatever, their friends are that age group, and they're not multi-age. So that's kind of a thing that is a little bit different in Graveyard Book because Bod doesn't really have any friends his age. But for the most part, I think you do see that in these books where the protagonists, their friends are their age. And that doesn't necessarily speak to my experience. I tended to hang out with kids 2 or 3 grades older than me. I was so done with people my age. I thought they were all childish. I've always wanted to be a grown-up since I was 2. And then ever since 25, I've wanted to not be a grown-up anymore. So it's an issue. Other thoughts on that? Because we have a question. Shay asked a question. If this novel was written today, do you think that the students in the school would have been more accepting of Frederick or less? And Shay said, I have 2 daughters in high school, and they have lots of friends who are gay, lesbian, or bi. It's an interesting question. I don't know. Some of you mentioned your high school experience. These would be middle schoolers, but I'm curious, like, do you think these things have changed? Because I honestly have not been a student in high school in well over 20 years. So I don't know. So most of you are much more recently out of school.
I know in my high school, they had what I think has changed so much is how the people like me who advocate for the LGBT community, in my high school they created, it was the year I left, so it was kind of, I feel like, behind even. The year I left, they created the Gay Straight Alliance. So it was people that were gay, straight, and bi, and that transgender, and then the people that were their allies. So people that would advocate and educate people like on their behalf. So I think back then, probably like when Frederick was going through this, he didn't have that. And I feel like in today's society, a lot of those kids have people that will be there for them. Even though, and they'll still deal with the bullies. I think that'll never go away. But now they have people that'll be on their side, even if they aren't, even if they're different from them.
Probably still less likely to have it at the middle school age, which is where these characters are. Right. But yeah, I know here in town, Rose High School, I do some work out there with teachers, and they have a Gay Straight Alliance at the school. I don't know how active it is, but I know they have one. Did others experiences?
I just know that I didn't, in high school, I didn't hear a lot of talk about gay, straight, transgender, but I know like recently in college and the past like 3 or 4 years that it's been a lot more talked about, a lot more awareness of it, and understanding and knowledge, because I feel like some of the people's like hate that comes from it is because they don't know about it or they don't have the knowledge.
Yeah, I think we've certainly seen a push at ECU, but a very recent push. I remember I was here when the LGBT Resource Office started, and that actually began as a grad student's thesis project. Summer Wisdom in Sociology did a study of all the campuses in North Carolina to see if ECU was more or less supportive than Chapel Hill, Asheville, Wilmington, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things she discovered is that a good number of the larger campuses had some kind of space on campus for LGBT students to go, and the ECU had none. And it ended up at the time, the provost, Marilyn Shearer, and the Chancellor Ballard went to her thesis defense. That would have scared me shitless, by the way, if the university provost had showed up at my thesis defense. But they were so moved by her data and statistics that they ended up offering her a job when she finished part-time to start a center on campus. So yeah, that's been within the last 5 or 6 years, but that's a really interesting shift we've seen here on campus. But I think that also colors how we see, everything else. Like, well, it's happening, so it must be going on. Other thoughts?
I feel like I was exposed to like the LGBT community at a young age. My cousin is happily gay, as he likes to call it. I laugh because that's like his slogan. And his boyfriend turned from when I was younger. They were just friends, but I was naive. I didn't know what was going on until I got older, and he turned into a boyfriend. They've been together forever. It didn't really get really into my life until I went to college, except for like in middle school and in high school, like where I live, like people would say like they were gay or lesbian or this and that, but then you never really knew if they were telling the truth or if they were just trying to fit into a crowd. And that was with like where I live, because like just one girl in particular that I can remember, like she would date a girl one week and then date a boy the next week, and now she's married to a man and pretends that she's never did what she did in high school. So it just, to me, like now being exposed to that, I had a great friend that I went to Towson University for 2 years. His name's Kyle, and he changed my perspective on a lot of things and like how I feel about that situation. Because to me, you're a person regardless of who you're interested in and how you feel. Like, I'm going to treat you like a person. And he has created like so many doorways at this university, like you were talking about with the community here, and it's just really inspiring to see that. So to me, in middle, there was never any resource like for students who are in this community to go to, whereas we could just go to a guidance counselor and say what we ever wanted to say, but it was never really focused on one specific thing.
I think at the middle school level, what we end up seeing mostly or hearing mostly is anti-bullying. So Jim Howe has a book called The Misfits. It's a middle school age book. He's the writer. He got his career started by writing the Bunnicula series. I don't know if any of y'all read that as children. Sort of like a third grade, about a bunny who's like a vampire. They're somewhat ridiculous books, but he wrote a book called The Misfits. It was about all these different middle schoolers who felt like they didn't belong. So the goth kid, the gay kid, the girl who likes to play sports that aren't acceptable sports for girls, like football, or and so they create a Misfits club. And so I think we see a lot of that at middle school level and in elementary school, like these sort of anti-bullying projects. So I think one of the things I like about, it's hard to say, is that Frederick never has sex. Like sex isn't part of this book. It's just about trying to figure out who you are, and then what are the things that make it hard to be 13. And I think CO and Carmen and all the girls have lots of experiences about what it's hard to be 13, including Carmen, where Victor cheats on her or gets caught with another girl, and that breaks her heart. But then she's trying to be strong, and And we see the boys at play and kind of ignoring them a lot. Like there's all kinds of things going on, but I think at the heart of it, it's really that question of bullying. And that's what we see a lot in the elementary and middle school texts is, how do you create environments where people don't bully other people? Or if people are being bullied, what can you do as an adult, or how can you help young people read books to not be bullies? And then, adolescent or high school age texts, it's much more likely that the characters are going to have had sexual intercourse, usually off the page, as I noted in the discussion board, or that'll come up in adult literature. Like that just doesn't typically show up. But it is a really hard thing. Like, how do you bring up a gay character? Because then the first thing is, well, how do you know you're gay if you haven't done anything? And I don't know. I guess the response is, how do you know you're straight if you haven't done anything yet? So that's part of what Theo and the Sexies are all trying to figure out, except Carmen, who's definitely been making out with Victor for a while. That was sort of ramble. I don't know where that was going, actually. But it's also 7:26, and so we only have about 4 minutes left. This chat went very, very fast. Other comments or thoughts about the novel, things that we didn't come up in the discussion, or something you thought was really interesting you wanted to bring up that either surprised you in the book, or maybe surprise is the wrong word, but anything about the book that you want to talk about before we leave?
Well, I know that when I first started the book, and I was first reading about Frederick and how he was kind of eyeing Victor the whole time, I honestly thought that him and Victor were going to end up. I thought Iggy was just some side character that nobody was going to care about, and I thought that Victor was gay, I thought Frederick was gay, and I thought they were a perfect match for each other.
That is not exactly how I read it, but this is really how far we've come. That I was like, "There's no way, not Victor. Victor, he's." But I don't know. Maybe if we see enough Degrassi Junior High or whatever, you expect. But it's always the big athlete who's the closet. They're actually what's that novel? The Geography Club by Brett Hardinger is actually that plot. If you're interested. It's also a movie on Netflix. It's not a great movie, but it's all about this sort of average Frederick-style kid who is chatting online. It turns out it's like the quarterback of the football team. And they end up, for a while at least, in a relationship, and then it doesn't work out. Yeah, Iggy's sort of the surprise winner in this. He's been picked on the most, but then he's in a way he gets Frederick. So good job, Iggy. Way to go. Other thoughts?
I was just wondering, like, would this book be acceptable in any geographic area? I know, like, I guess they say North Carolina is a part of the Bible Belt, but would this book be, somewhere where, like, being gay is just, like, downright wrong? Would this be acceptable in a middle school for middle schoolers to read?
I think this book is going to fall on the shelf for a teacher that is, I'm glad I know this, because if a kid comes to me and seems to be struggling, I can say, hey, go read this book, grab this book off the shelf. It's definitely not a book that's going to be taught like it's a whole class set. Like, no whole class, I don't think, not North Carolina. Maybe in Asheville, maybe would read it. I mean, you might see, there are definitely schools, like there are LGBT schools in New York, in Connecticut, Rhode Island. There are definitely places where this might show up as a class read. I think it's very unlikely in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, for that to happen. But I think a lot of times a book like this is one of those things that teachers have in their back pocket, kind of like Bridge to Terabithia, which is just a beautiful book. I don't know if y'all have read Bridge to Terabithia. It's absolutely a beautiful book. But it was one of the first YA books to deal with death amongst young people, and teachers would really hold that in their back pocket. They wouldn't teach it, but the minute one of their students experienced death from a friend or a family member, it'd be the first book they'd say, hey, have you read, how about you read this? As a way of helping them to sort of cope and think through, like, the emotions they were experiencing with death. So I definitely think there are teachers who use these kinds of books. on individual levels to recommend to kids. But yeah, I still think books like this would be very hard. Parents would freak out. I mean, there are still parents who would be upset if you assigned your whole class to read Harry Potter because they think it's about the occult and the devil. So, you know, like that's always going to be a hard thing for a classroom teacher. But for me, particularly when I do a lot of work on anti-bullying with middle school and elementary school teachers and workshops, this is one of the texts I bring up as an example of, you know, you may want to have this, maybe you may want to know this book exists because you'll have kids that are going through this. I think the other thing that didn't really come up much in the discussions, but is also something worth thinking about, is, particularly as you were going to be teachers, even if you don't have gay students, like you're going to teach second grade, you're going to have kids who have gay parents. And this is increasingly going to be common because marriage is legal. Adoption is, for the most part, legal across the country. And so I think the ways in which this enters the classroom as an everyday activity now is, like my own son, who has 2 moms living in New York, you know, his teachers have been very cool about this from day one. The other kids don't care. Both moms come to school when it's time to do some kind of activity or help out with something. And so, you know, he's not the only one. He has 3 kids in his class who have gay or lesbian parents. So there's the whole thing where, like, do we read about it? Do we bring it in? But the reality is, as you've noted in the discussions this week, these things are part of are part of students' lives. Sometimes they're very underground, sometimes they're not. So even if you don't bring in a book like this, it's very likely that one of the kids you teach, or one of the, if you have children, one of the kids in your children's class may have gay or lesbian parents. And so the question is then, how do we talk about that, right, when the kid comes home with it? And that's always an uncomfortable moment for parents. Jackson, when he's 8 now, but last year at 7, one night it was, hey, why do I have a belly button? And where do kids come from? And so you had that one was like, oh shit, now I gotta talk about reproduction. Like, no one's ready for that conversation ever. Ever. And then once you have it, your 8-year-old is happy to forget you ever had that conversation with him ever, because they never want to talk about it. But, anyway, good question, Brady. I rambled a bit, as usual, but a good question. It's 7:33. We're really at the end of our time. If there's no more pressing questions, I'll let y'all go and get back to your lives. But I really do appreciate your taking time out tonight, 30 minutes of your lives, to hang out and chat about the book. And thank you all for being available, and to Sarah for organizing this for us Thursday night. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the class, the discussion on Graveyard Book, which will run through the weekend. I think people are starting to get a little bit behind with their reading, which makes sense. So that discussion will stay open through Monday. So I hope you enjoy the book. Maybe you won't cry like I do at the end of it. And I will see you online. Bye.
Bye.